The following is a video podcast from the Wessels Living History Farm.
Okay, I was born in Omaha, Nebraska, 1937.
Well, I was born in Omaha, in South Omaha. I grew up on 22nd and 8th Street in South Omaha.
And when I say Omaha, Nebraska, I have to be fair to my roots in South Omaha. Emphasis on South Omaha. You can always tell when somebody is they say they're from South Omaha. I'm skeptical. We always refer to it as South Omaha.
My father was in the livestock commission business in the stockyards in South Omaha.
I'm looking for a cowboy to take me for a ride.
Well, I worked there in the summer when I was a kid. And
I followed my father and older brother into the stockyards. My daddy was down there for 55 years, give or take a month or two. And I started there in the 55, and I'm rather proud of that particular year because 1955 was the world record run for livestock, for cattle in the Omaha Stockyards. It was in the fall of 1955.
when cattle or hogs or whatever came into the livestock, they came in and were received by the Union Stockyards Company. And my job was to go and pick up the livestock that were received, that were assigned to my father's company, and bring them from the receiving pens up to where they were sold and displayed and sold. And so I did that.
But it was bedlam keeping track of 53,000 cattle on a Monday. And that was what they call the fall run, which is historically the first Monday in October. A lot of cattle were of course, slaughter cattle. Perhaps half of those numbers were replacement stocker feeder cattle that came from the Sandhills, that came from Wyoming, from Montana, the Dakotas, Colorado. They would come from Utah, Idaho, western Nebraska, from the Mississippi West. That doesn't leave a whole lot of the country left. Because the ranch country, wherever there's a ranch, those cattle at that time, in the 40s, 50s, 30s, into the 60s, came to Omaha. Some might go to Sioux City, some might go to Kansas City, but the big guy on the block was Omaha. That they were shipped in those days, usually by rail.
First time I remember when we shipped some fat cattle was when I was 5 years old. We'd ship them by rail and load them at Lushton and ship them to Omaha. They had 30, 40 acres of yards and a commission house. And I don't remember how many commission companies there were, but then they'd sell them for you the next day at this market. This company had yards, small pens. They'd put them in, and then the packer buyers would come around riding on a horse, and they'd bid on them. They'd go all over the yards bidding, and the commission man would either take their bid or he wouldn't. But there was be a half a dozen or so packer buyers that would come around and bid on them. And they'd sell them to the highest bidder after a while.
The fellows that sold their cattle in those days, their fat cattle, then they would go up on what we call the hill, which is the western part of the stockyards, and buy the replacement cattle. But for a young man like myself working in the stockyards, all I saw was one animal with 4 legs that had to be watered, fed, weighed, kept track of, moved from here to there, and it was glorious bedlam. Okay, when I started working there, I would be at work at 4 a.m. in the mornings, as any of the yard people were. And the yard people, which I start out at, were the ones that were out in the yards, gathering the cattle from the truck chutes or the chute house that came in by rail, taking them to our respective pens where we were assigned, and we would take them there. We would sort them. When I say sort them, oftentimes a farmer would ship in 6 steers and 6 heifers. Well, we didn't keep the 6 steers and the 6 heifers together. We would sort off the 6 heifers and the 6 steers and put them in. Why?
Why? Yeah.
Different values.
Okay.
Different values. The steers usually were worth more money per pound than a heifer. And then there were some of the buyers, the packers, only wanted steers or only wanted heifers. Okay, then we would get those cattle ready, like I say, from 4 till 8 a.m. We knew after a while you get there, you know that the good cattle, the steers, they go up in the show alley, which is where the larger pens for the better cattle are shown. You always want to put your cattle in a pen that's advantageous to them. If you had great big cattle and they weren't looking for big cattle, you'd put them down in a pen that had a low bottom because they just didn't look like they were that big against the back of the pen. Well, there's a lot of fence sticking above those cattle. And that's what was done. We learned that, tricks of the trade. It was kind of funny. What was the danger? Okay, a lone cow was a vicious animal. Now, and we always used to chuckle about this. The cow would be home when it was home in somewhere in Nebraska or Iowa. The owner would say, "Well, that cow's never bothered a thing in her life. She's just a little old dairy cow." Well, that cow has been disrupted from her lifestyle, and she's gotten down to where all these other animals are mooing and bellowing, and people are hollering, and they get real anxious sometimes. You learn to read the cattle. You can tell by their eyes and the way they're moving their heads, and if they're flared, we call the flared nostril. You see that, you better be on your gear because you might have to head for a fence. We were usually done with our chores and tasks, 7:30, and then we would wait for the market to open. The market by regulation couldn't open until 8 or even 9 o'clock. It depended on, seems to me it was 9 o'clock in the winter and 8 o'clock in the summer. Then we would probably take our coffee break and go back downstairs, work our way down to the exchange building on the first floor. We'd go down there for breakfast lots of times. But then we would, hurry up and wolf down our coffee and brag about our exploits from the weekend and things like that. And then go back out to the yards. And if it was a hot market, in other words, if the packers wanted cattle quickly and needed cattle, they would pay the price, which was usually that was what would make a higher market.
And then after they were sold, they had to be weighed, and I would take the cattle to the scales and get a scale ticket, and then they would go to whoever bought them. And I did that sort of thing in the summertime, and that was very interesting, but plenty of exercise and good work for a kid. And, I enjoyed that and made a little bit of money.
Okay, then we would sort those, take the cattle, and we would get what we call a turn at the scale to weigh the cattle. We would get a hold of the number man. The number man, why they call him that? Because he regulated the numbers. Whoever got him first, whether it was my commission firm or the one across the alley or down the alley, we got the first turn to weigh cattle. We would weigh them and keep track of them for ownership. If a load of, say, slaughter steers, the high prime, better kinds of cattle, we would weigh perhaps 25 or 30 of them at one time. And the scale is where ownership changed. They would go on the one end of the scale belonging to Mr. and Mrs. Jones. They'd come off the other end of the scale belonging to Armour or Swift or Cudahy or Wilson. And that was the point of sale right there. Yes, most of the packing houses were right there. If the packer needed cattle right away, they would take them immediately and walk them to their respective plants. Armour, Cudahy, Swift, Wilson, which the big four then, and they would take the cattle, most of the cattle, off of the market in a particular day. Then we would go back, and of course there would be more sales. Then most commission firms had a steer salesman. That was the top. If you were a steer salesman, you were right up there alongside of God in the stratosphere of the stockyards. And then there was a heifer salesman. He was okay. And then it got down into cows. cows and bulls and calves. And those cattle, then they would be weighed later. And when the day was done and all the cattle were sold and weighed, then the yardmen, which is where I started, we would go down to the truck chutes and or the rail chutes and check on incoming cattle to see if any of them were ours, that we could take then up to the pens and have them rested overnight. And then when that was all done, then we got to go and take off and do our social life, which the Stockyards was a great place to do it, because there was many, many times, like I say, get to work at 4 o'clock. To this day, I still get up early.
I got a 40-gallon Stetson hat with a 38-foot brown. We could dance around the outside, baby, till we both fall in. And you can...
When I think of the Stockyards, I don't think of cattle and pens. I think of the rank and file and the parade of characters. And when I say characters, I mean characters.
If you'll be my cowboy man.
I used to go with my father. He'd call on his farm customers, and I would go with him as a young man. And so I got to know an awful lot about agriculture by just being exposed to it that way. I wasn't a farmer, but I met and talked and visited with many, many farms during my youth. Even though I was a city slicker, I knew what farming was all about.
Well, we would know that a certain particular farmer was going to ship so many cattle, and we'd be watching for them. And oftentimes they would come in on a Sunday afternoon. And young lads like myself down there sitting on the fence like crows, waiting for the cattle to come in, because we knew that Mr. So-and-so was going to be having a truckload or two of cattle come in from any time from 3 to 6.
What was it like, 5, 6, 7-year-old going to Omaha?
Quite an event for me, because we got to ride on the freight train. And my dad, if you shipped a load of cattle, well, you by rail, then the railroad would give you a free pass home on a passenger train. And they weren't supposed to have children on a stock train. But the depot agent at Luston sold my dad a ticket for me. And we got to Lincoln and we stopped off and they do some switching in Lincoln on the trains. They had what they call a beanery there where the railroad help work, and so we got to eat lunch there. Then we went to get on the train while the conductor said I couldn't get on because you weren't supposed to have kids on the train, on our freight train. And Dad said, well, we got this far, what are we going to do about it now? And he said, well, come on. So he let me on, and I got to ride clear to Omaha. And we got into Omaha about 4 o'clock, and they let us off out there in the railroad yards, and we had to walk quite a ways to get to the exchange building. And at that time, the commission men left their offices open. You could go in and sleep on the benches. It's usually too late to go to a hotel or anything. So we went in the commission man's office and laid on the bench till morning, and then went out in the yards and found our cattle. And
the owner of the particular cattle and his wife and kids and whoever else, they would come into the yards, and in a period of a couple of years, you get to know them and you know their families.
Actually, it was just like having a little vacation, because you got these feeder cattle in the fall, and then you fed them your corn that you had raised, and then when they were finished, why then you called the trucks in to come haul them to Omaha. 13 head would fit on a standard grain truck. Maybe you had to have 2 neighbors or 2 trucks come in and haul them in, because you kind of wanted them all there at the same time, unless they hadn't developed at the same rate. Well, you would pick out the ones you figured were finished, and then you'd make another trip. Omaha was made with all these different commission firms, so you had your favorite firm. So the next morning, you would get up bright and early, and you would drive to Omaha to see your cattle being sold. Make sure that they got sold right. Well, then the family got to go along, and we got to go shopping a little bit downtown Omaha, no less. So it was a yearly excursion. If the cattle sold good, why then you maybe got to eat at Johnny's Cafe or someplace yet.
Which was a treat.
Yes, that was a real treat.
What did you have at Johnny's Cafe?
Well, beef, of course.
And the gentlemen usually came out to the pens where the cattle were at. They liked to watch the cattle sell, which they still do today. The ladies of the family oftentimes would sit in the lobby. There was the lobby was the lobby, of course, of the building. There was a third floor mezzanine above that, which was, you know, a ladies' lounge. Nice sofas and chairs and tables, and oftentimes the place on Mondays and Tuesdays was full of ladies waiting for their husbands to finish up out in the stockyards. Little kids sprinkled all over. The little boys would go with their daddies and their granddads, and the little girls would stay in there. Once in a while, there would be a wife would come out to see what was going on, and they usually stayed up on the high walk. Now, the high walk is just that. You didn't have to go through all the pins and the brown stuff, as we referred to it earlier. Now, this is the Randy part of me would see, you know, the ladies up and the daughters up on the high walk, and jeans were not a popular item to wear then, so there were views that were afforded to us that we, you know, being young and active, we enjoyed. Perhaps that's not what you want to hear. That's the way it was. Well, in the 50s, when I started there, I'd say 80% of the wives would come along with then, because then it was, while they were selling their livestock, their hogs or their cattle or their sheep, it was also a social function for the family. And they would come in and they would do their, take care of the livestock marketing, and then go over to South Omaha, just a block or a few blocks away, to Phillips Department Store, which is no longer there, Walgreens, Kresge's, that type place. But then they'd go downtown to Brandeis, Nebraska Clothing Company, Goldstein Chapman's were the ladies' stores. My mother was a milliner there for many years. There were another reason to go downtown for the shippers, the farmers, was a place called the Castle Hotel. I don't know if it's still there or not. It was on South 16th Street. A grand kind of a hotel. The lobby and the restaurant part was all done in paneled wood. And when I say paneled wood, I mean like oak or mahogany. It wasn't done with some staple gun and glue job on the wall. Yeah. And this was historically the place where ranchers, feeders, shippers stayed the night, was at the Castle Hotel. Lovely place to go eat. Good service, treated them royally. And that was in downtown Omaha. A lot of folks would come in and make a social event out of it, do their shopping, buy the new clothes, perhaps fall of the year, maybe pick up something for the kids for school.
It was not always families that came in, correct? In other words, sometimes the gentlemen came by themselves.
Oh, yes, often. But a lot of folks, shippers, enjoyed the offerings of the saloons in Omaha, South Omaha. They perhaps had a little more strength when they went in there as opposed to maybe when they were home in their smaller towns and nobody saw them, you know. The saloons in South Omaha did a gigantic business. Just, you know, people retired with opulent wealth from running a saloon there in South Omaha.
There were other hotels that were real close to the stockyards as well, correct?
Yes, they were.
Yeah.
However, they had offerings that perhaps we would avoid in pleasant company. There was the Blue Moon. It had a clientele all of its own.
So the farmers who came into town without their families, some of them may have.
Rumor has it that they
Rumor has it.
occasionally went there. First-hand knowledge, I'd have to speculate. I'm not giving to wild speculation.
She will be my Cinderella, and I'll be her cowboy man. I can roll both her on the belly, and I can ride her on the thing. And she will be my Cinderella, and I'll be her cowboy.
For more, go to www.livinghistoryfarm.org.